Welcome to another episode of Corporate CPR, where we breathe life back into your organization, projects, and processes, giving you insights to recovery and avoiding corporate mortality events. Today, we'll be talking about how leaders not exercising their strategic muscles correctly might be killing your company. And joining us to contribute to the conversation is Rich Horwath. Welcome, Rich.
Jana, great to be with you today.
I'm so glad you could join us. Can you share about your background?
Sure. I'm the CEO of the Strategic Thinking Institute. I founded the organization 22 years ago, and it was doing some strategic planning at the time. And a manager came up during the break and said, "You know, Rich, my boss said I'm too tactical. I need to be more strategic. How do I do that?" So I did some research, Jana, and back then, as you know, most of the books on strategy were really about corporate strategy, financial strategy, and there wasn't really anything for the individual leader or manager to go from tactical to strategic. So I've devoted the last 2 decades to helping managers think, plan, and act strategically. I've written 8 books, a couple hundred articles, and really enjoy working with organizations to help beef up that strategic thinking and planning muscle.
Oh, that's fantastic. And so, talk to me a little bit. I guess strategy is a term that is thrown around quite a bit. And so it probably has a lot of definitions and probably even some inaccurate definitions. So can you define strategy for us a little bit when you're talking about the strategic muscle and all of that?
Sure. And you're exactly right, Jana. And the research shows there's 91 different definitions of strategy over the last 10 years in the literature. So there's a lot of confusion out there as to what is strategy. And if you as an organization don't have a consistent understanding and common language for strategy throughout the organization, you're wasting thousands of hours and lots of people's time and energy just trying to get on that proverbial same page. So I define strategy as the intelligent allocation of limited resources through unique system of activity to achieve goals. So simply put, strategy is how you plan to use your resources to achieve your goals.
And where does it come into play then, maybe long-term versus short-term goals? Because I think one of our oversights in the U.S. can sometimes be being too short-sighted, right? And being like investor or market focused rather than what's good for the company in the long run. I mean, we should have an investor focus, but long-term focus versus short-term, does that play into your definition at all? The length that we're looking?
Yeah, certainly. I think there's got to be a common understanding with the leadership team on what is our planning horizon. So when I work with organizations, typically you've got 3 horizons. You've got your short-term horizon, which is a quarter. You've got the midterm horizon, which is a year. And then long-term horizon, typically these days is 3 years. Some folks are still doing 5 years, but based on the changing dynamics with technology and so forth, I'm seeing 3 years as being the longer time horizon. So you've got to have understanding of what is our resource allocation look like for the quarter, for the year, and for 3 years. And then as you do that, you really want to make sure that everybody in the organization is answering 2 fundamental questions. What are we trying to achieve and how are we going to do it? And strategy really involves answering that second question, how are we going to do it? To your point, long-term, short-term, the big issue I see is people are not being specific enough in creating milestones in their objectives. So obviously the objective is what you're trying to achieve. We want to quantify it, put a time frame on it. But if that's too loose and people don't have milestones, then we don't really have a good gauge as to when to change strategy. So the big issue I see is not necessarily long-term, short-term. That's part of it. But the bigger part is not building milestones in so that you've got specific points that you can identify that, yes, we're tracking or we're not tracking. And then if we're not tracking, then we can consider changing tactics first, then strategy.
How much in this, well, I guess maybe before we dig into the deeper details, how do you view the strategic planning process?
Yeah, so the big issue I see with strategic planning is what I call the organizational lobotomy. There's no new thinking. We cut out the thinking part of it. It's all process, it's all templates, and those things are important. But the reality is the plan is only as good as the thinking that goes into it. So when I consider strategic planning, I really think one step back and I think about strategy development. So I think about
Mm-hmm.
5 phases. I think about discovery. So what's the market intelligence, competitive intelligence that we can gather before we get together, we can all take a look at. Then second phase is strategic thinking. So let's have a couple sessions where we're generating new ideas, new insight. It's much more dialogue versus the confined discussion. So we're really open-ended thinking, using frameworks to generate innovative ideas. The third phase then is the planning piece where we start, as you think about a funnel, we start to get to the neck of that funnel and we're creating some direction. And then the fourth phase is really creating that plan and the rollout of the plan. So how are we rolling this out to all levels of the organization, all functional areas? And then the fifth phase, which is often overlooked, is throughout the year having a strategy tune-up. So just like you would take your car in to get tuned up, we need to tune up our strategy as well. So quarterly, you should be meeting for 2 to 4 hours with your team and asking, what's changed, what's working, what's not working, and does our strategy still hold?
I mentioned though that organizations kind of get stuck on that strategic, that innovation and within that strategic thinking. And you mentioned some frameworks. Can you share a little bit about that and how you really get that innovative thinking out?
Yeah, one of the frameworks I love to use is called business model innovation. It's funny, we think about the business model a lot when we're a startup, but it's actually more important for mature companies. So the mid-sized to large companies that have been around for a long time, it's even more important for those companies to revisit their business model. When I think about a business model, I try to simplify it into 3 phases. It's how you create value, how you deliver value, and how you capture value. So one exercise to stimulate innovative thinking is to have those 3 areas: create value, deliver value, capture value in the left-hand column. The next column then is the norm. So how do you and your other people in the industry normally create value, deliver value, and capture value? What's that norm look like? Then the far right column is the innovation, or what I call the deviation from the norm. How could you do things differently to create, to deliver, or capture value than the competition is, or than you've been doing in the past? So I find that's a really productive exercise to get people to think outside the comfort zone and to innovate a bit.
And then one of the challenges in larger organizations, and I mean, even in small ones, I guess to some extent, is that alignment. So as you've developed these plans, how do you ensure that there is alignment within the organization and that people continue driving to the same targets and outcomes?
Yeah, I would say there's 2 things that are really critical. The first is having an action plan, and the second is being intentional with communication and collaboration. So the first one is, if you've got a 30 or 40 slide deck, which is your plan, that's too long to act on. You're never going to update that. And then the other piece is, some people have the Excel spreadsheet with a list of customers and market share data. That's not a plan either. So again, what you want to have is, you want to have basically a 2-page, what I call a strategy print or blueprint. Page 1 is all the new ideas, the new insights, the new thinking around customers, competitors, market patterns and trends, and then your company. Page 2 then is your action plan. So it's really your goals, objectives, strategies, tactics, your metrics, and you can even include purpose, your mission, vision, values there as well. So if you don't have that 2-page or 3-page action plan, you're never going to be using the plan during the year. So that's the first one, is have a 2 to 3-page action plan. And then the second piece is, you've got to be intentional with collaboration. So you as a leader should be meeting with your counterparts in other functional areas or other parts of the business at least monthly or quarterly at the bare minimum. And having a sit down to not just answer fire drills and we've got these problems and issues, but talk more proactively about, what are you trying to achieve? Here's what we're trying to achieve. Where is some common ground that we can find some alignment? So I find if you have a strategic action plan and you're intentional about collaboration at your level across the organization, you've got much greater chance to have alignment.
And, so obviously you talked about the horizon changing from 5 years to 3 years because of how quickly the market moves. And so thinking about how quickly the market moves, how much resilience is built into this planning, and how do you build in resilience into your plan? So if something changes, you don't go down with the market, I guess.
Yeah, that's a great point. So, I make a distinction between strategic thinking and planning. Strategic thinking is the generation of insights on a continuous basis that leads to advantage. The strategic planning is when you channel those insights into formal direction, resulting in strategies and tactics that you'll implement. So, the key is strategic plan. You shouldn't be changing that every week, but you should be thinking strategically each week, collecting insights. And I define an insight as a learning that leads to new value. So you and your team should be collecting those insights. You should be sharing those insights, not just within your team, but across the organization if you're really going to create a learning organization. And then you've got to be able to take those insights, like I said, on a quarterly basis, do the strategy tune up, and inject those new ideas, some of those innovative ideas into the plan to determine what should we keep doing, what should we reallocate resources to, and then what should we stop doing or do less of. So I find if you use that cadence, that helps a lot. The other thing I'd say has been helpful is scenario planning, where as you look at the next 3 years, develop 3 to 5 scenarios. So here are 3 to 5 situations that could develop that are at a macro level over the next 3 to 5 years. I would label those situations. So give them an interesting name like, sales Armageddon, or, marketing status quo, whatever it might be. And then create goals and objectives and strategies and plans, mini plans, micro plans for each of those different scenarios. So if something does change from a seismic perspective in the business, you've already started thinking through that and can start to implement that more quickly.
One of the, I guess, things I see a lot of complaints around is about not getting that input and that information from the right levels. Do you see that, and how do you combat that?
Yeah, that's a good point. So a lot of times we see in organizations, strategy is like the 10 commandments. We're giving it from on high and say, go forth and strategize. And we're not including people in the conversation. And I use that word conversation intentionally. When we develop strategy, it should be a conversation. Really, strategy should not be a birthday where it happens once a year. There's a lot of signage and fanfare, and then it goes away for 11 and a half months. Strategy should be an ongoing conversation about the key business issues. So you as a leader should be engaging your people at least monthly at a strategic level, not the operational tactical stuff. That's important, but at a strategic level, asking them about, here's our direction. What are you seeing? What's happening from a competitive perspective? Are customers thinking and actions changing? All of those things that are at a more macro strategic level, those should be conversations. And then once you're setting direction, you've got to take the time as a leader to share with people why this is the direction. If you give the people why, research in the social sciences shows that people's buy-in goes from 60% to 93%. So we've got to give people the why. Even if they don't agree with it, the buy-in is going to be much higher. So have conversations, get people's input, have ideas and insights shared, and then give people the why as to what you're doing.
And then I guess, how do you measure the health, I guess, as you're moving through, whether it is working or you need to pivot? What are some of those key KPIs or metrics that folks should be looking at?
Well, it's amazing to me how often profit and profitability and margin is not really looked at. I see a lot of people and a lot of plans where their goals are really revenue-based, growth-based, but they're not necessarily profitability driven. And again, when you have competitive advantage, we can define competitive advantage is having superior value relative to the competition. So if you're providing superior value, benefits over cost, then you should be earning profit on a regular basis. So I see too many organizations not really focused on profit as the primary metric. And again, I think margin and profit really should be that driver. Then the second piece is you as a team. So let's say you're an HR team, a finance team, an IT team. You've got to have metrics as well. And I'm not talking about 15 or 20. I'm talking about what are the 2 or 3 things that are going to be most important to you contributing to the organization reaching the goals and objectives that's been set there. So again, I think each functional area shouldn't abdicate that and say, well, the overarching corporate strategy and goals, that's what we'll just use. That's not right because each area has different resources, time, expertise, talent. So you've got to tailor your goals and objectives and strategies and tactics to the talent that you have and the resources you have under that overarching umbrella of the corporate goals. And I find that organizations that are able to marry those things up are the ones that have the greatest success in measuring the health of what they're doing.
Yeah, I heard you mentioned in this instance, you should only have one to or just a couple, 2 to 3 key metrics that you're tracking. You also mentioned earlier about, not having a 30 or 40-page strategy. What are the consequences of focusing on too many things?
Well, I think the one of the biggest challenges, and the research has shown that I've done, is that having too many priorities is a top 5 challenge for managers. Because what happens is you as a leader can set those things, and I hear people saying, "Well, we want to be ambitious and we want to get these 17 things done." But the reality is, the people that are at the mid-level of the organization, and really the ones doing a lot of the lion's work of the business, they're going to feel too overwhelmed. They're going to be too frustrated because they're not able to bring as much value when they're spread so thin. And these days, people are still asked to do a lot of things with minimal resources. So again, I think the biggest issue is overwhelming and burning out your best people, because what happens is your best people, as a leader, we know the research shows we tend to go to the same people over and over again when we've got to get things done. And so we start to burn out our best people when we've got too many priorities. So again, that's why I'm a big believer. You should have no more than 3 to 5 goals, and then really 1 or 2 priorities that you're working on at a time.
Hey listeners, loving corporate CPR? Make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing on your favorite platform. Stay up to date with all our latest insights, expert interviews, and actionable advice. Subscribing is quick and easy. Just hit that subscribe button now and you'll be notified as soon as new episodes are released.
Well, but do you also find that even beyond the 1 or 2 people, that you end up having a whole bunch of things half done because it's taking too long to get anything done because so many people have their attention focused on many different projects and priorities?
Yes, Jana, that's a great point. It's amazing. We live in such an activity-oriented society that we need to remember that activity and outcome and deliverables are not the same thing. So what we need to really understand, and when I talk with leaders, I'm always saying, look, evaluate everything you're doing on 2 criteria: probability of achievement and impact to the business. And if you start to do that, you start to evaluate the initiatives on probability of achievement and impact to the business. And let's say we use a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being low and 10 being high for each of those parameters. What you see a lot of times is people working on stuff that's a 1, a 2, a 3 on impact. Why? Because it feels good at the end of the week to say, hey, we can check this off the list and check this off the list. But you as a leader, your responsibility is to make sure that your people are working on stuff that's really important to the impact of the organization. So if you allow that checklist mentality of getting stuff done that's not moving the needle, shame on all of us for allowing that. So again, I think looking at probability of achievement and impact is a great way to make sure that you've got a finite number of priorities that are really important to the business.
I want to, I guess, go a step down before coming back up again, because you're just talking about how we're such an activity based culture, and it's true. It's so much easier to check things off a list than to even spend time thinking. So, how do you get leaders as individuals to exercise that strategic muscle, even strategy within their department, and not be a victim of the urgent versus the important?
Yes, that's a key point. Jeff Weiner, the CEO of LinkedIn, said the key to time management is carving out time to think as opposed to constantly reacting. If you don't take the time to think strategically, you'll always be reacting to your environment. That was his quote. And I agree. And the leaders that I work with, coaching workshop, one of the things we talk about is you've got to book that in your calendar. You've got to book that time individually. So typically the CEOs I'm working with are booking 90 minutes, at least 90 minutes a week on their own to think about the business at a high level. And then typically they're booking 60 minutes a week collectively with their team on strategic level issues. Again, not operations, not tactics, but strategic level issues. So that's got to be in the calendar. It's not one of the nice movable things that the administrative assistant can book over, at a moment's notice. Those things have to be carved. And Jeff Weiner, the CEO of LinkedIn, uses that word carve. You've got to carve that into your calendar. It's got to be dedicated time. And then once you have that time, you've got to have some structure to it. I'm a big believer that, just blue skying is fine, but you've got to have some structure. So I give people three things to think about. I think about what's the external environment look like. So jot down what's happening, the market, customers, competitors. What's your internal environment looking like? So what's happening with your culture, strategy, process, systems, people. So what takes, take a few minutes to think about that. And then think about from an innovation standpoint, think about your customers and think about emerging needs. So things that have not been solved by other companies or your company yet, but from a customer perspective are things that are on their radar. So take some time to think about what's next for the customer from a value perspective. Because if we're not thinking about what's next or the future state of value for the customer, we run the risk of becoming obsolete. So again, I think, you've got to carve out that time in the calendar, and then you've got to have some structure to it as well. Again, thinking external environment, internal environment, and then really about the customers that you serve.
And so then in those weekly meetings with the team, any suggestions on format or structure there? Because I could see how that could evolve into just status updates or something like that.
Yeah. And again, I think that's a great point. One of the reasons that you want to have a 2-page action plan is, as a senior leadership team, you should be sharing your 2-page plan with your counterparts before you meet each week. They should be going through what's happening in your business and jotting down questions or issues. One of the big misses I see is people spending time in these meetings giving updates. So they're spending 10, 15, 20 minutes of this monologue update to a group of people sitting around listening. That is a complete waste of time. Leave the monologues to the late night TV talk show hosts. Anytime you're with your team, it should be really chewing on the meaty decisions and issues facing the business. So to your point, if you're getting your team together, everybody should look at their plans. Everybody should come in with 1 or 2 questions overall that they have for the business. How are we going to overcome this challenge? What about competitor X? So bring those 1 or 2 questions in, and that's what the team should be spending time on. You shouldn't be giving each other information and updates when you're together collectively. You should be solving problems and making decisions.
And what about then, do you have examples, or have you seen a company where, whether the market changed or they were on the wrong track and they realized it and pivoted? And how does, a pivot like that work and be successful?
Yeah. So, that's one thing we've got to really think about. The pivot concept came from Silicon Valley. And when you're a startup, you've got to be able to pivot, right? Because you're not quite sure about the market. You're not quite sure about customers. You're not quite sure about your value proposition. So in a startup mode, pivoting is really important. However, once you're a more mature company, you've really got to watch the idea of pivoting, because if you're a mid-sized to big company and you say, we're going to pivot, well, you've got, that battleship you're trying to turn, and you can't do that really quickly. So again, I think the leaders that do the best job of changing, what I'll say is changing course slightly, are the ones that have strategic direction. And then they're constantly scanning their environment to see if the competition or market trends or customer value is impacting their direction. If that's the case, then you as a team need to have a conversation to determine, do we need to make that change? I'm thinking about a company that I worked with for 10 years, and they were in the food industry. And as they were evolving, one of the things that happened, they were very successful, but one of the things that happened was they started to lose market share to companies that were really emphasizing organic, because this was not an organic type of company. And this, again, was about 10, 15 years ago. So organic was coming into play, but it wasn't as prominent as today. So they realized that, look, we've got a good strategy, we've got good market share, but this is a macro trend that is not going to go away. They talked to research scientists, they talked to food scientists, they talked to environmental groups, and they understood by doing their research that this was not a fad that was going to evaporate in 3 months, but they knew this was a long-term trend. So that's a key piece, is before you change course, do your homework. Don't just react like a bumper car at the carnival. You've got to really understand, is this something that's going to be a significant change? So in this case, it was going to be a significant change. So they wound up hiring some PhDs that were from a food science organization to help them really understand what it meant to be organic. And then those people started hiring folks to start to source different products that could be organic. So they slowly built that into their product line over the next couple of years. So again, I wouldn't say it was a pivot as much it was understanding the changes in the environment and then just altering their course a bit.
How, there, you mentioned research a lot, and there's a lot of data out there and a lot of data points, both internally and within the market. So how do you sift through data and use the right data to make sure that you're just making your decisions on a solid foundation?
Yeah, that's a challenging one. And obviously AI is going to play a huge role in that as we move forward. I would say the one thing that I see today is we still need experts. And the reality is, in a business, you've got to have people with expertise in the business. And so the key is, I see a pattern where people are bringing in, a leader from another industry because they've got a good profile, they've had success in that other industry. Can that be successful? Definitely, it can. But as that leader comes in, if there's not other experts in the business on that area, then we don't really understand what's an insight and what's noise. So I think the biggest thing is, for you as a leader, are you building your expertise on the industry, on the products, on the competition on a regular basis? Not once a year when you do your strategic plan, but are you an active learner when it comes to competition, customers, and the marketplace and trends? And you should be, when I mean active learner, you're documenting, you're recording those ideas, those insights in those areas. So you're continually building up your well of expertise. And I think that's the way you can determine what research is important and what is going to be just noise.
And then any framework or thoughts on how you then tie that into action?
Yeah. So, I mean, again, I use a fairly simple process when I'm helping folks think through the business. But the one thing I would say is, you've got to, as a team, when you're canvassing the business, you've got to look at market, customers, competitors, and company, and you've got to look at the positives, the neutrals, and the negatives in each of those areas. What I see way too often when I look at 300 to 400 plans a year, what I see way too often is companies focusing only on offensive strategies. And when I say offensive strategies, that means taking what their strengths are and combining those with the positive opportunities in the market. That's a part of your plan, but that's not all of your plan. You've also got to look at neutralizing strategies. So what are the threats, external threats that could hurt your business competitively from a market standpoint? And then how can you neutralize those with your strengths? And then you've also got to, and it's counterintuitive, but you've got to look at your weaknesses and the threats externally. So your internal weaknesses, external threats. And then you've got to think about, how do we shore up those weaknesses so that we can defend the threats that could potentially hurt our business. So I think if you do those things, looking at market, customers, competitors, company, positive, negative, neutral, and then start to play around with those combinations, that's going to give you a good opportunity to, be fully 360-degree aware of what could be coming at your organization.
Let's touch on the competitors for a moment, because well, it sounds like you kind of just basically described SWOT analysis, and a lot of people focus a lot on competitors. And there's a couple of things that, trends that I've read about and witnessed is one, we focus on the known competitors, and usually the ones that displace a company are the unknown competitors, like they come out of the blue. And then two, I don't know how effective the strategy is to do what all the competitors doing. I see that a lot, like where somebody will start doing something on social media, so competitors will do the same thing, and then it's just noise. And so just curious what your thoughts are on that kind of, how do you strategically address competitors, and what does that look like?
Yeah, what you hit on, Jana, is really important, that idea of competitive convergence. So when we're initiating a new activity or tactic, it's causing us to converge with the competition in the mind of customers. So to your point, the essence of strategy is differentiation. It's providing unique value. And so if we're doing the same thing as the competitor in the same way, we're not being strategic. We're not going to differentiate ourselves, maybe other than price, which is not going to typically be sustainable. So the key is, when you look at competition, and to your point, traditional versus non-traditional, the big mistake I see is leaders looking at their products and not looking at customer value. If you drill down to customer value, so what are the benefits that they're getting and how are they getting those benefits? Then you have a much better idea of non-traditional competitors. You can spot those faster. But if you just look at products, that's when you create those blind spots in your organization that, hey, we're gonna miss the next thing because we're focused just on our products and the competition's products. We're not focused on what does value look like and how is value evolving in this marketplace. So I think those are some of the key pieces. And again, the organizations that I see, to your point, when you described, doing the same thing as the competition, they're reacting to the competition. Those companies typically don't have a strategy in the first place. They haven't identified their goals and objectives, and they haven't identified a strategy. Again, I defined it, as the allocation of resources through a unique system of activities. So you're performing different activities than the competition, or similar activities in different ways than the competition. If you don't have that differentiation, then you don't have a strategy, and then you're going to be forced to react to everyone else. And that's a frustrating position to be in.
What do you think? I mean, yeah, because so that can be really hard. So especially in the services, I would think, just thinking about like consulting, even what you do, right? You are performing the same activities, and it's really hard. I mean, a lot of consulting companies talk about, well, the difference is our people, but they all say the difference is a people, and it probably actually is in a lot of ways, right? Because if you can attract the right talent, you get the right people, you can actually have the best advice and be able to provide the most value to an organization. But that doesn't sound very differentiated. So how do you, I guess, really look at those differentiators in an environment where it's hard to demonstrate differentiation?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think you've got to drill down to the value proposition. And again, I think we think about who are the customers that we're targeting, what are their needs, how are we serving those needs in a unique way? Those three elements. And again, especially in the services industry, really having a defined customer. So who is our customer? It's not just, well, we go after CEOs, or we go after, mid-sized companies or large companies. What types of organizations, what types of people in those areas are we really going after? And then understanding, what are the one or two value factors that mean the most to them? That sounds simple, but oftentimes that gets glossed over, especially as a services company gets larger and larger, and they're trying to do more and more. They become more generic, so to speak, and they forget about what are those one or two value factors that's actually going to make the decision in the customer's or the prospect's mind. So I think we've got to come back to that. And a fun exercise is to actually map that value proposition out. So, across the top row, you've got what are the, let's say, 1 to 10 value factors that the customer would use. And then on the x-axis, or the y-axis, the vertical axis, you've got the different players, and then you've got the different categories. So, what's the scale from let's say it's 1 to 10, and then we've got service, convenience, speed, expertise across the top, then let's map out ourselves, map out our competitors on a scale of 1 to 10. That's an interesting way to visualize, do we have differentiation or not? I've actually done that exercise, and people are shocked sometimes that there's no differentiation, especially if they've been around for a while. It's a more mature company. To your point, they've gotten to that competitive convergence, and there's not a lot of differentiation.
Mm. Well, what would you say then are the biggest pitfalls then when you think about maybe talk about it at three levels at the where do companies fail at a strategic, in their strategic thinking? Where do they fail in their strategic planning? And then where do the leaders as individuals most often fail? What are those, that might all lead to a corporate mortality event? What are those things that people should be watching, organizations should be watching out for?
Yeah, so I'd say number one with strategic thinking is just the lack of awareness that everybody in the organization is responsible for insight generation. And I define an insight as a learning that leads to new value. So, Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, had a great quote. He said, look, everybody in our company is responsible to be innovative, whether they're doing operational work, product work, customer service work. He said, we don't have an innovation department. I expect everybody to be generating those ideas. And that's why that company's been so successful, because everybody in the organization is generating insights, sharing those insights, and they're continually getting better. So that's the first thing. Strategic thinking is creating an awareness that, look, everybody in our organization should be generating and sharing learnings that lead to new value on a regular basis. The second point for strategic planning is we've got to have something that's usable, relevant, and updatable on a regular basis. If you've got a big Excel spreadsheet or you've got a big PowerPoint deck, people are not going to use that. They're not going to update it. 3 months into the year, it's in a binder, it's buried in your computer, and nobody's referencing it. So you've got to take that plan, and that plan can be important from a thinking standpoint to get you where you need to be mentally in your plan, but then have a 1 to 2 page blueprint that's driving your daily activities. And then the third piece, just from an execution standpoint, an actioning standpoint, you mentioned earlier not getting distracted by the urgent and really focusing on the important. Again, I think you've got to have the ability to prioritize. And again, I ask people to continually look at what they're doing and evaluate it on 2 criteria: probability of achievement and impact on the business, because those 2 factors will change potentially throughout the year. The probability of achievement based on what the competition's doing, based on internal resources, and then the impact to the business may change as well. So continually be reevaluating your initiatives and your priorities, and then have the guts and the discipline to cut stuff off that's no longer adding value.
Oh, those are good tips. And so we're kind of running out of time. So I guess I should roll into the question of what 3 things you want to leave top of mind with people would be.
Yeah, so I would leave people with 3 A's. If we're going to think strategically, we don't need a textbook to do that. We need 3 A's: acumen. So anytime you interact with someone during the day in a one-on-one, a staff meeting, you're reading email, acumen says, what's the insight here? What's my learning? What's my takeaway? We should be asking that all the time and recording those learnings. Second is allocation. So great strategies is as much about what we choose not to do as it is about what we choose to do. So we need to make decisions to cut things off from our time and attention on a regular basis. And then the third A in this framework is action. So again, if we're going to be focused and we're not going to be the bumper car at the carnival bouncing from one thing to the next, just being purely opportunistic, then we've got to have a really digestible 1 or 2 page plan. And so again, I think it's really about having a conversation with your team to generate the ideas that go into that plan. So the third piece on action is really have interactive conversations and dialogues throughout the year versus once a year like most companies.
Really appreciate the insights that you've been able to share today, Rich. How can folks get in contact with you or learn more about what you do?
Yeah, thanks, Jana. I'm a big believer in sharing lots of free resources. So if you visit strategyskills.com, we've got dozens of white papers, infographics, podcasts, videos, lots of free things that you can use to build your strategic thinking and planning skills. And I've got a new book called Strategic, the skill to set direction, create advantage, and achieve executive excellence. And you can find out more about that at strategyskills.com.
Excellent. Thanks so much for taking your time out to be on our show today.
Thanks, Jana. Appreciated being with you.
Yeah. Well, until next time, keep your organizations healthy.